Okay, yeah, I think what I agreed with virtually everything Alan said. My presentation, I'm going to focus more on sort of where we are in the public policy arena, so specifically what kind of legislation and regulations we've seen and can expect to see in the near future. But first, I'm going to provide sort of some definitions and some background on this. I'll move on to a couple of issues that policymakers are beginning to consider, and then I'll close with some recommendations. So I think first we should define what we mean when we say autonomous vehicle, and unfortunately this is one of the major problems if you look at policy reports or policy statements from policymakers. It's all over the map. We're moving closer towards common definitions, but we're not there yet. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to use the ones I'm using here. So we're talking about intervening advanced driver assistance systems. We've seen some of these early technologies phased in recent years, including adaptive cruise control, lane keeping assistance, and self-parking. And I'm going to get to the NHTSA levels of automation, but those would all be 1 and 2. So in this context, in this NHTSA context, autonomous vehicle refers to a highly or fully automated vehicle and one which can direct the core driving functions. So broadly, this means that autonomous vehicles are motor vehicles capable of highly or fully automated driving, which means computer direction of a vehicle's steering, braking, and accelerating without real-time human input. So here are the NHTSA definitions, and I'm going to focus on levels 3 and 4. So 3 is the driver can cede full control of the vehicle in some situations. You've probably seen the first Google prototype, which made its appearance a few years ago. This would be level 3. It still has a steering wheel. It still has pedals. The driver can still take manual control. Level 4, you may have seen earlier this year the latest Google prototype, which proposed taking out the steering wheel, the pedals, and basically having this fully self-driving cart. And the driver, in this case, has no expectation, or in the case of a vehicle where you don't have these controls, ability to retake manual control at any point during the trip. I'll skip this. We're actually these NHTSA definitions came from May 2013 from a preliminary policy statement. We're actually probably going to be moving something closer to the SAE levels in the future, but since we have NHTSA right now, I'll stick with those. So the potential benefits: reduced accidents. Human error is a factor in approximately 90+% of crashes. Reduced congestion, assuming if we, all else being equal, if we didn't see dramatic increases in VMT, which a lot of the activity-based models are suggesting we'll see, we could see reduced congestion and thus improved air quality, local air quality. And then, as Alan mentioned, improved individual mobility for traditionally mobility-impoverished populations, the disabled, elderly, and youth being the largest there. Here's what some of the developers are saying, and this is all, as Alan emphasized, and I'm going to emphasize over and over again, and this is all very speculative. All this technology is very proprietary. These companies are very concerned about trade secrets, protecting their trade secrets. So we don't really know all that much about what's going on in Google's secret lab, but we've seen some public statements as to when we can expect highly automated vehicles. Volvo is planning a 2017 100-volunteer pilot program in Sweden, and this would rely on connected vehicle technology, and I'll go a bit into that in a moment. Google is saying 2017, 2018 for some type of automated vehicle. It's unclear what that would be, but that is still their stated goal. Nissan has said 2020. Again, we don't know exactly what that would be, but that's their goal. And then Daimler and Continental have come out with 2025. Most likely, these are the level 3 NHTSA vehicles. So there's still going to be a steering wheel. There's still going to be brake pedals. There's still going to be accelerator pedals. You're still going to be able to take manual control. So a lot of experts surveyed have projected, and again, highly speculative, but 2025, by the time we see these level 3 vehicles, fully automated vehicles where you have no expectation or ability to take manual control, maybe 2025 to 2035. I lean more towards the later year. So yeah, two technology models to consider when we're talking about automated vehicles. One is the independent automated vehicles that most of the private developers seem to be pursuing at this time. This is Google's self-driving car. It relies on a variety of sensors and onboard data to make these decisions. And then there's the cooperative automated vehicles. Europe has been leading the way in with several projects. This is a photo of the SART project, which wrapped up in 2013. But there's a pretty cool project called City Mobile 2, if you want to check that out. And that is basically providing connected vehicles where you could have a central hub, but you would have these kind of shuttles that would drive around. Places like retirement communities, college campuses, things like that. Low mass, low speed, geographically restricted, not highway, but that's one way we can go. So there's advantages and disadvantages with each model. On the independent automated side, these are the ones that are capable of directing driving with only the onboard equipment and data. Cooperative automated vehicles could have, all of those same sensors, all of that same capabilities, but in some way they rely on vehicle-to-vehicle or vehicle-to-infrastructure communications to direct the core driving task. An advantage with the independents is that you don't need a bunch of mandates to standardize the fleet, at least in principle. And you don't need expensive roadside infrastructure upgrades, which should be appealing to DOT types since they can barely fill in they can't fill in the potholes right now. So with the cooperative automated side, you're probably going to you'd see fleet mandates. You'd see something come down from NHTSA telling them, here's the type of technology you're going to use, here's how it's going to talk to, here's how vehicles are going to talk to each other. And you're probably, in order to get some of the benefits, like the platooning that Alan mentioned, where you can pack a bunch of these vehicles at very close following speeds and move them at highway speeds, you're probably going to have roadside infrastructure investments needed to achieve some of those goals. One advantage, independent automated vehicles, the cybersecurity risks are lower just because the data are distributed. But because these are deterministic machines, they can still be manipulated. Many can still be manipulated even when they're unconnected. Large cybersecurity risks, in addition to the questions of data ownership and management of what you'd probably need is a central security system to safeguard some of that data. Big questions there for the cooperative automated vehicles. So independents have greater potential mobility benefits just because they can be more creatively dispatched and deployed in a far wider variety of circumstances. The cooperatives have greater potential congestion emissions reduction benefits because of, mainly because of platooning. Here's a point I like to make a lot. So we often hear press reports about, oh, X state is considering legalizing these vehicles. Well, the truth of the matter is these vehicles are already legal. So we should talk about recognizing legality, not legalization. And this is because motor vehicle codes have been along for a long time, and they simply don't address the relevant features and operations of these vehicles, and thus don't forbid them. So these are completely legal, and so when you hear press reports, people saying that, oh, only 4 states right now are these currently legal, that's false. Outside of New York State, which has a weird provision in its motor vehicle code that says that the operator must have one hand or prosthetic on the steering wheel at all times during operation. So you could make the argument that they're illegal there. Platooning, in fact, may be illegal because of some of these codes' safe following distance requirements. But that's a separate issue, and we're not to platooning yet, so we don't really have to worry about that. But outside of 4 states and D.C., this legality isn't recognized, and I think going forward, ultimately this will be important. There's no reason to have an out-of-date motor vehicle code that doesn't recognize these things. But there is a question of when do we want to start moving forward with this legislation, and I'll get into that a bit more. Because right now, because there's so many unknowns and there's so much speculation, there's a great risk of legislative and regulatory overcaution. And I think this may represent one of the more significant threats facing this technology. So here's a map of, they're legal in, or not legal, what am I talking about? They've been recognized as legal in Nevada, Florida, California, Michigan, and D.C., and there's a number of other states considering. There's a few who aren't on here. I think Tennessee is one that will be looking at legislation in the near future. As far as regulations go, Nevada promulgated theirs in 2012. California has promulgated its manufacturer testing regulations, but we still haven't seen the consumer side regulations, and those are due at the end of the year, although we were supposed to see a draft at the beginning of last month, and that isn't out yet, so wait on California. D.C., kind of a similar thing. They proposed rules in April of this year. We should have had final rules by June. We didn't, and we don't know where those are right now. Federal level, there's nothing really, other than this preliminary statement of policy that NHTSA put out in May 2013. That's where those levels were, and they basically recommended that the states don't do anything crazy. That was sort of the takeaway from NHTSA. There is, however, there's a connected vehicle mandate likely to be proposed in the near future that could have implications for automated vehicles. Unfortunately, NHTSA, when they released the advance notice of proposed rulemaking, they didn't contemplate this technology at all. So what are the issues and challenges? These are some of the things that policymakers are starting to ask. So there's safety, obviously. Are these things safer than manually driven vehicles? Federal versus state roles, cybersecurity, crash ethics, which is pretty interesting, and then products liability is obviously a big one. And then bad legislation, regulations. Unfortunately, those have already occurred, and we can expect to probably see more of that. So this has popped up in a few papers, but basically, in order to demonstrate, and this is using just a standard Poisson distribution, but in order to demonstrate that these vehicles are safer than manually driven vehicles, they need to get up to 725,000 miles, give or take, of crash-free representative driving. Google, with its prototype, has reached about 700,000, but whether that's representative, because we don't think they're trying this in blizzard conditions, for instance, it really depends, and we hope to see research come out from Google once they reach some sort of a threshold when they can say this. But that's a challenge. We're not there yet to say confidently that these are safer. The feds in the states. So you've got NHTSA with its safety regs. Many of these dictate design. Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration has some similar, but they have a lot more operator-machine interaction. Things, hours of service. Can't wait for the Teamsters to weigh in on automated trucks. But these are things that people are thinking about. So we have this relatively clear federal role. However, not so clear. The states, while they're responsible for licensing, operations, and testing, despite what the feds have said, NHTSA and FMCSA regs do not clearly preempt state courts on matters of liability. Most recent example from a few years ago was before the Supreme Court, Williams v. Mazda, where Mazda had turned out a vehicle that met all of the safety belt requirements. This was over safety belts. State court said, well, even though you've met all of these standards, you could have been safer. And basically, the Supreme Court said, they didn't really say much of anything. They basically said, the states can handle this right now. So we may want to look at actually, federal legislation that would either dramatically reform NHTSA or that would clearly have NHTSA preempt the states, because that's a mess you don't want to get into with this. Cybersecurity, just like I said, I'll wrap up pretty quickly. You can have so the idea here is basically, even if you don't have connected vehicles, a single rogue vehicle, just because these machines are deterministic, they're machines, you could have it manipulate thousands of vehicles on a roadway just by engaging in some sort of nefarious behavior that causes all of these vehicles to react predictably. So that is something that needs to be addressed. I know of a couple papers out there on this, but the research is still being developed. Crash ethics, I think this is really interesting. So what happens if you're in this car and it recognizes that you are going to crash? So you don't have an option, you're going to crash. how do you crash? So these automated vehicles are going to have to be able to determine the possible outcomes of a trajectory choice in this situation. They're going to have to figure out the severity of these outcomes and then calculate a conditional probability of an outcome occurring based on those trajectory choices. So this is a problem because you could imagine designing a vehicle that's so safe that it would protect the occupant of that vehicle, from going off into a ditch where risking some broken bones, some bruises. You could say, you could imagine that vehicle being programmed to ram into a crowd, which would be safer for the occupant of the vehicle, but not good socially. So you presumably do not want crash ethics that look like that. So Noah Goodall's at Virginia Tech, and he's developed this three-phase strategy. So basically, begin with a rational moral system designed to minimize crash impacts. And this is sort of recognizing injuries, generally preferable to fatalities. It gets crazier. You want to start introducing machine learning. So you want these machines to be able to take an input of, what do actual human beings do in these situations, and then further flesh out those common ethical values. And then this is my favorite, because this is speculative technology that's nowhere there. You'd want these vehicles to be able to explain to you why they made the decision that they did in normal, natural language, and then correct any sort of ethical deficiencies. But this is sort of his strategy. I think it's good. We're not going to see 2 and 3 in Generation 1 vehicles, but we might see something approaching 1, that injuries are preferable to fatalities. Products liability. Basically, the takeaway here is that as manufacturers get more data on how consumers are using their products, they're going to face heightened foreseeability. Well, you should have known that your product was going to harm me, so that the lawyers go after them. In response to that litigation risk, they're going to demand even more data. And then in response to that, their foreseeability and litigation risk goes up. So imagine it as a spiral. This may not be a bad thing if it occurs. You could imagine this spurring all sorts of technological innovation pretty rapidly, but it is something to consider. I would want to note that there is plenty of reason to believe that products liability can evolve on its own without doing that. I'm going to go really quickly over these last ones. Here's an example of how not to regulate automated vehicles. DC, when they initially proposed their bill, they were going to require that all autonomous vehicles be powered by alternative fuels, because the council member who had introduced this took a ride in a Toyota Prius that Google had outfitted with this and assumed that all of the vehicles would be like this. And then, because these vehicles wouldn't be paying the gas tax, it would impose a special mileage-based tax on all of these vehicles, a separate tax structure, and then mandated this driver's side. Those first 2 were removed, thankfully, after harsh criticism. But we still see these risks of sort of people putting the cart ahead of the horse in a lot of these situations, and we don't want to see that. I'll skip these because I think Alan covered these pretty well. So what do I tell policymakers? There's a lot of unanswered questions, a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of risk of you guys stepping in and doing something that you think is right, but in fact will have a negative effect on innovation. And if that delays the consumer rollout, greatly increases prices, that means you're going to have, assuming these vehicles are safer than manually driven ones, that means increased property damage, congestion, injury, and death. So I've come up with, you may have noticed I don't have many concrete recommendations for specific policies here, and that's in large part because there's a lot of uncertainty. Usually when I talk to lawmakers or other policy folks, I say, here are things not to do, and sort of let the technology evolve independent of policy right now. But I've come up with these sort of 6 guiding principles that I think are okay. Hope to further refine them. But I think we should always start with recognizing and promoting the huge potential benefits. No one wants some, why should we care about this technology in the first place? But we shouldn't care, or policymakers shouldn't care too much in that, they want to perfect the technology through law or regulation. So a lot of this is, we're going to have to push back against people who have some idealized notion of safety that these vehicles should have to make. And we don't, these obviously aren't going to be perfect. These cars are going to crash. But we do hope that it's going to be a much lower frequency than manually driven ones. But we shouldn't let the precautionary principle get in the way of that. We certainly shouldn't presume to know how the technology and products liability law will evolve over time. I think common law does a pretty good job with this, and I don't think there's necessarily a huge role for statutory and regulatory intervention, which is why I think we should minimize legislative and regulatory intervention, especially at this early stage. And then from there, what policymakers should really be doing is focusing on developing these clear and simple rules that preserve technology neutrality. So what they should be looking at is going through existing regulations, existing federal motor vehicle safety standards that why these vehicles aren't going to need side mirrors. And for one of the an example of this is Tesla and the automakers have recently petitioned NHTSA to update their rule on mirrors because they would like the ability to replace those viewing functions with cameras. Same thing here. You may need to hire more bureaucrats at NHTSA to get this done in a timely manner, but it involves going through the existing regs and existing motor vehicle codes with a fine-tooth comb and updating them to reflect the new reality. And then the last one, I kind of touched on this, but make clear the legislative and regulatory distinctions between these highway and non-highway vehicles. These low-mass, low-speed, geographically restricted, driverless carts shouldn't be subject to the regulatory requirements that a highway vehicle is. So we need to make that clear. So far, none of the legislation that's come out of the states has done this, and we hope in the future that this. I've been in talks with some folks. We hope to see this, but I think number 6 is an important point that's often missed in this discussion. So with that, I'm gonna end, and thank you, and be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions at the end?